Good evening to everybody. I am Mark Cohn, National Program Coordinator of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and very pleased to welcome you this evening for a panel discussion on the topic of how independent are independent schools. By way of introduction and setup, allow me 2 points of clarification. What is the JILV, and why does this topic interest us? The Jewish Institute for Liberal Values investigates and highlights where critical social justice, at a minimum, shuts down or rigidly controls discourse, but more maximally, where critical social justice manifests as all sorts of anti-Semitism, anti-critical thinking, anti-heterodoxy, anti-liberalism. Our focus is set on K through 12 education and how students in particular, though parents as well, are impacted and influenced by activist educators presenting as social justice warriors. We are addressing education being steered away from learning and critically needed skills, and where that education gets steered towards anti-Western and anti-American ideas. In early December, the National Association of Independent Schools, NAIS, held a People of Color conference during which they set out to uphold their, quote, commitment to equity and justice in teaching, learning, and sustainability for independent schools. At the conference, the keynote speaker, despite being lauded as a woman who teaches from kindness and inclusion, spoke of Israel as a racist country committing a genocide. The speaker was not alone in such comments, and needless to say, Jewish attendees felt anything but kindly treated and included over the course of the 3-day conference. When asked for a reaction to the incident, JLV's CEO and founder, David Bernstein, noted that the event's anti-Israel rhetoric was an outgrowth of the NAIS's embrace of the DEI ideology, which promulgates a binary worldview that often casts Israel as the oppressor. A few discussions within our staff, following some of the press and fallout from this conference, led to our asking, how independent are independent schools? In other words, where are the ideas and ideologies professed and taught from the national level and or state accreditation agencies influencing and enforcing alignment within independent schools? I'm so very grateful for our panel this night, who are well-versed and can speak directly to the background and the current reality facing independent schools, public schools as well, and most importantly, can give us tools and strategies and guides for parents. For many of you who follow our JILV work, you will know two of our presenters, though I will still introduce them. We will hear this evening from Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, who is the JILV Director of Education and Community Engagement. By training, Brandy is a social worker, a writer, researcher, and advocate. She holds a doctorate in education from the University of San Francisco in international and multicultural education, and an MSW from the University of Southern California. You can find her online through her X account, of course, but significantly online blogs and magazines from Free Black Thought, Newsweek, White Rose, Times of Israel, and elsewhere. Next up, we will hear from Dr. Mika Hackner, who is the JLV's Senior Research Associate. Mika has a PhD in politics from Brandeis University. Her research focuses on militant democracy and institutional threats to liberal democracy. God knows that one of the greatest threats to liberal democracy is through education, and Mika is 100% on that, most notably through the Substack she maintains, which is the K-12 Extremism Tracker. We'll put the link in the chat later. She and her work appears in the Jewish Journal, the Free Press, and elsewhere. She is also the person behind many of our past and upcoming backgrounders. Last, I'm very pleased that we can welcome this evening Evie Wilpon-Schwartz. Evie is the co-founder of her own biotech company, leveraging her experience across businesses of all sizes and stages to drive innovation and strategic execution. Most importantly for us, Evie has transitioned her success to be mission-oriented by co-founding Peer K-12, a grassroots initiative addressing anti-Semitism in K-12 education, and the Jewish Alumni Council, a national coalition of Jewish alumni groups to address anti-Semitism on campuses. Her work reflects a deep commitment to addressing complex challenges at the intersection of education, policy, and security. An Athena Pinnacle Award nominee, Evie is also an active angel investor, advising ventures at the forefront of innovation. She has earned her MBA from Columbia Business School and BA in Economics from the University of Pennsylvania. So first of all, welcome to you all, both our presenters and those who are on the call tonight. Each of our presenters will speak from between about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. I'll be monitoring the chat the whole time. There's a comment section that people can drop in questions to pose to the panel. We are recording on this night, and we will call resources for you as well, most likely sent out through a follow-up email later. So in the meantime, welcome. We're glad to have you. How independent are independent schools? Brandy, you are going to start us off, I believe.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really excited to be here with you all. Next slide, please. I want to jump right in. So the National Association of Independent Schools, although not an official accrediting body, serves multiple purposes regarding independent and private schools. One, they serve as a repository for private schools. So the National Association has standards and best practices that many member schools follow. The NAIS also provides workshops, conferences, and institutes where members are provided with a lot of information and resources that they then bring back to their private school classrooms. And these are just a few of the reasons why schools and state accreditation organizations choose to be NAIS members. According to their website, over 2,000 member schools across the country, representing more than 700,000 students, are members of the National Association. And as Mark spoke to, I'm sure many of you are aware of the recent NAIS conference that took place in December of 2024. My colleagues are going to be speaking about that in more detail in a little bit, but I want to make one point now. There are many defenders of the National Association who rightfully point out that they don't accredit independent and private schools. But these same folks seem to minimize the influence that the National Association has on private schools, ignoring the fact that state and local accrediting organizations often follow the resources, materials, and recommendations that are put out by the National Association. And so there's a reason why so many schools choose to be National Association members. In short, just because the National Association does not directly accredit private schools does not mean that they have zero influence on what private schools teach in their classrooms. And so for the sake of time, I just want to show a couple of examples that demonstrate the National Association's influence on state and local accreditation organizations. Next slide, please. On the New York Association of Independent Schools About Us page, it states that it's affiliated with the NAIS and with the New York State Coalition for Independent and Religious Schools. Next slide, please. And you can see from the New York Association's Principles of Best Practices for Equity and Justice that they're almost carbon copy, identical to the National Association's Principles of Good Practice for Equity and Justice. Next slide, please. Demonstrating their commitment to the National Association's Principles of Good Practice, the New York Association hosts events like this one, this job fair to promote diversity. Now, I'm not an attorney, but I believe that hiring based on race violates civil rights and non-discrimination laws. So notice the flyer has a little bit of a disclaimer. It states, quote, "Please note that while no one will be excluded, this event is designed to diversify the teachers and staff within independent schools with a particular focus on increasing the number of teachers of color," end quote. Next slide. So it may not seem controversial that a school would want an ethnically diverse teaching and administrative staff. However, it does seem that the New York Association makes racial, ethnic, and color diversity one of its core missions rather than academic excellence and scholarship. Next slide. And while some parents may choose to send their children to tuition-paying schools due to diversity initiatives, I doubt that most choose to pay thousands of dollars each year in tuition and fees so that their children's school can hyper-focus on race rather than academics. In fact, diversity and equity initiatives are so central to the New York Association's accreditation process that they're listed as a strategic criteria for evaluation. Next slide. So we can see diversity play a role in the New York Association's teaching and learning criteria for accreditation. So it shouldn't be a surprise that New York and other state and local accreditation organizations that are affiliated with the National Association are influenced by the positions held by the National Association. It also comes as no surprise that the National Association publishes resources and holds conferences that hyper-focus on racial and color-based diversity at the expense of academic rigor, even when those events fuel bigotry, like the recent People of Color Conference in Denver, where Jew hatred was center stage. Next slide, please. So here, let's look at the Pennsylvania State Level Accreditation Organization, the PAIS. Again, although the National Association is not an official private school accreditation org, the Pennsylvania Association states the following on their expectation of member schools page. Quote, when a school is accepted as a member of PAIS, it not only means a commitment to participate and contribute to the accreditation process and professional learning programs, but it also means adherence to our membership and accreditation standards, as well as acknowledgement and aspiration to fulfill the National Association of Independent Schools principles of good practice, end quote. Next slide. So I'd like to quickly look at a few schools to show how the National Association's principles of good practice are making their way into private schools. In San Diego, you can see La Jolla Country Day School lists the NAIS's principles of good practice, equity, and justice as one of their dignity resources. The Brearley School in New York expresses their commitment to becoming an inclusive, anti-racist, and anti-biased institution. Dalton, also in New York, boasts about its intentional commitment to establishing equity and diversity. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight the influence that the National Association's principles of good practice have on independent schools, because even though data has begun to show the negative impacts that these DEI programs are having on education spaces, private schools, accrediting agencies, and the National Association of Independent Schools are continuing to promote and even require these initiatives. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So one last point. The NAIS issued an apology for the anti-Semitism at their most recent People of Color conference. There's a group of activists who then issued this letter via the Zen Education Project, calling on the National Association to rescind that apology and to issue one to the very speakers who spewed vile Jew hatred at that conference. And with that, I want to hand it off to Mika. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Brandy, and thank you, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. So what I'm going to be talking about is basically demonstrating the premise of our fearless leader, David Bernstein, that the outcome of the POCC conference is fully predictable, given how steeped NAIS is in its programming in this DEI worldview. So there's been a lot of attention, and rightly so, on the NAIS's People of Color Conference. The NAIS, as Mark said, calls the POCC conference its flagship of NAIS's commitment to equity and justice in teaching, learning, and sustainability for independent schools. But that isn't the only programming that NAIS runs throughout the year, and it isn't even its flagship program, right? That would be the NAIS annual conference, now called the Thrive Conference, which is for independent school educators and administrators across the country. You can move to the next slide, please. So the POCC is billed as the NAIS's commitment to equity and justice, and one might expect, therefore, that the programming at Thrive would differ somewhat from the programming at POCC. But here's what's on the agenda for this year's conference. First off, they have 3-hour workshops for affinity groups. If you're unfamiliar with an affinity group, it essentially means that you are grouped in with people who share your same immutable characteristics. So that could be skin color, sex, things of that nature. So here they have 3 affinity groups separated into BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, People of Color, LGBTQIA+, and women. And if you happen to hit on all 3 of those, then I guess you get to pick and choose which one you want to go into. So let's have a look at just one of these 3-hour workshops. This one is called Leading Through Identity, Resilience and Advocacy, Empowering Educators in the LGBTQI+ community. And this is being presented by Patty Hearn, who is the head of Seattle Pride. The point of this workshop is to help LGBTQI+ educators gain actionable tools to enhance visibility, support, and resilience within school environments. Seattle Pride put out a statement in June 2024 accusing Israel of committing genocide, right? That is Patty Hearn's organization, Seattle Pride. They accused Israel of committing genocide. They accused Israel of apartheid, occupation, and pinkwashing. And in their statement, they say Seattle Pride stands in unwavering solidarity with Palestinian people who are undergoing a genocide. So those are the 3-hour workshops that include affinity groups. But there are more general 3-hour workshops. Next slide, please. And these include how your school can thrive, not merely survive, push back around human sexuality and gender education, and what doesn't kill DEI could make it stronger. The point of that 3-hour workshop is to develop new ways of implementing DEI in school, which would make it harder for activists or people who are opposed to DEI to complain. So there's more than just these 3-hour workshops. Next slide, please. There are also general workshops of a much more manageable length that are organized around different tracks. And these tracks include equity, inclusion, justice and well-being, government, leadership, school operations, strategy and innovation, and then teaching and learning, right? You would hope that teaching and learning would have the most sessions under their workshop track, but that actually goes to leadership. Leadership has the most sections, followed then by the DEI, equity, inclusion, justice, and well-being track. They have 24 sessions. And then the teaching and learning track has 22 workshops underneath it. However, even some of those 22 workshops are dedicated to DEI. So just to give a taste, next slide, please, of what would be covered in the equity, inclusion, justice, and well-being track. You have building bridges, fostering effective partnerships between DEI practitioners of color and white allies, advancing equity and inclusion through anti-bias hiring, which is what Brandy was speaking about earlier. And then the importance of mirrors, understanding the impact of out queer educators on LGBTQ+ students. The point of this workshop is to talk about the impact that having out educators and administrators has on students, and to discuss how having a mirror influence, that is having an adult be a mirror for your K-12 student in their private life. Next slide, please. In the teaching and learning track, you can also go to, next slide, please, sorry. In the teaching and learning track, you can also go to a workshop on teaching beyond the binary, interdisciplinary approaches to science of sex and gender. Or you can go to the workshop on integrating social justice standards into your school and practice. And the point of this workshop is to adopt Learning for Justice's social justice standards. Learning for Justice is a program of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It has been given the thumbs up by Rethinking Schools and the Zin Education Project. And the goal of this is to get educators to learn how to integrate social justice standards into the curriculum, into lesson planning, and into every aspect of school life. So that's in the teaching and learning track. Right, next slide, please. Just for fun, next slide, please, sorry. Just for fun, you can pay extra to attend this masterclass, which teaches you how to cope with parents who bully the school. That is, parents who might be concerned about what's going on in their child's school and maybe might be strident in how they approach the administration. How do you deal with bullying parents? So that's Thrive. Outside of the annual conference and outside of the POCC, there are even more programs that the NIAS runs throughout the year. Next slide, please. So this includes the Diversity Leadership Institute, the goal of which is to help educators think through issues of systemic racism, racial identity, and other DEI subjects. The Diversity Leadership Institute last year had sessions which included discussions of privilege and power, why race still matters, and a 3-hour critical self-reflection session, which sounds like torture. Okay, next slide, please. They also run the Inclusive Schools Network Institute in partnership with the Human Rights Campaign and Welcoming Schools. And the point of this, again, is to make your school more gender diverse. So to get school administrators and educators to understand intersectionality and how students' intersectional identities impact them at the school, to make the classroom more LGBTQI plus inclusive, and to include LGBTQI plus terminology within the classroom, etc. And then finally, next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Finally, you have the NAIS Equity Design Lab. The purpose of the NAIS Equity Design Lab is a leadership and professional development experience to help people address issues of social justice and equity inside and outside the classroom. And last year's Equity Design Lab dealt with the subject of grading for equity, which is a push to remove sort of traditional grading practices to try and make them more equitable. That is to look at not just, achievement of students, but student effort or, student hardship in doing an assignment. And so out of that, next slide, please. Out of that, you have the POCC and the Student Diversity Leadership Conference. These two events are held at the same time. The Student Diversity Leadership Conference brings together over 2,000 students from across the country to focus on effective strategies for social justice practices. And I think everyone on the Zoom is aware of the controversy around the 2024 POCC. Ruha Benjamin, pictured here, talking about the genocide in Gaza. Next slide, please. And Susan Barakat, who spent most of her time accusing Israel of genocide, downplaying anti-Semitic hate crimes, and pushing the idea of anti-Palestinian racism. Now, if anti-Palestinian racism is adopted by schools, it would make it near impossible to represent the Israeli side of the Israel-Palestine conflict, because anti-Palestinian racism says that you must recognize that Israel is a settler colonial state. You must recognize that violence is always wrong against Palestinians. You must recognize one narrative of the Nakba, of the War of 1948. And the point is that none of this came out of a vacuum, right? As David Bernstein says, this comes out of the fact that the NIS is steeped in, this oppressor-oppressed ideology, which comes out of adopting this DAI worldview. So it's no surprise that at the NIS conferences, this worldview will be front and center. And it's no surprise that it then filters down to students at these independent schools who will stand on stage, next slide, please, and accuse Israel of genocide and isolate their Jewish peers. And so, yes, the takeaway here is that what happened at the POCC, what happened at the Student Diversity Leadership Conference is wholly predictable, given how steep the NIAS is in pushing a DEI worldview in the classroom. Thank you.
So we've taken a really high-level look at the NAS. We've looked at their programming, at their ideology, at how it translates into programming. We're going to look now a little bit more closely at how that impacts schools themselves. We can put up the slides. Essentially, the NAS is a one-stop shop monopoly. And that monopoly is not only from a marketplace or trade organization perspective, but also from an ideological perspective. They have a stronghold on the independent schools and are funneling one specific ideology. And it's problematic. And you see it across what they offer, from that programming, from search firms, consulting firms, programming and events, trainings, tools, resources, data and resources, job postings, network opportunities, and so much more. Next slide. And so we're going to take a little look at a few of these. very quickly, because you may know them, Rodney Glasgow, the Glasgow Group, is a really integrated consulting firm that focuses on using the DEIB lens in order to transform education and businesses and such, but we're talking about education. He's very involved with the national level. He has his own group as well as is a person in his own right. He sponsors, or the Glasgow Group sponsors, the POC event. Very, very ingratiated individual, and very, very problematic, and very steeped in this whole critical CRT-based DEI lens. Next slide. And you're going to see that thread throughout, and that's what we really want to highlight here. Here is a search firm. This is a search firm that helps find placements for independent schools. And what do you see? They are diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consulting, front and center. Next slide. Here, briefly was mentioned the National School Leadership Institute, and that's where the leadership of the schools come to train and to learn. And we look at, for example, just one facilitator, Morva McDonald, who is the Vice President of Leadership and Government for the NAS. And if you look at her self-proclaimed information about herself, what does she focuses on? She focuses on issues of social justice in education. That is the first thing she wants everybody to know about her. And again, she's there for a reason. Next slide. The National Seed Project. This is a program that goes into individual schools, works across leadership, works across with teachers for professional development, as well as with parents. It's a program to learn how to communicate, to look at oneself and one's biases, and it's all built on the premise of white privilege. That's how the founder started it. You can see a lot of the resources focus around white privilege as a way to focus on the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion within schools. Next slide. Pollyanna, another organization very steeped into the NIAS, work with them on research. We can see that they focus on programming, going to regional conferences, putting on regional conferences, individual conferences. They have a racial literacy curriculum. They also have a teen council. And I think that that's one of the other interesting things is not only is the school being steeped in it and translating it to children, but these individual organizations also have outreach to the students as well. So it's doubly done. Next. Okay, the AIM report, the Assessment of Inclusivity and Multiculturalism. And before I talk about what this is, I want to set this up. I don't know who's familiar with the NCRI report on DEI pedagogy that produces hostile attribution bias. There's a research report that just came out, and I think it fits nicely in here, essentially saying that in focusing on anti-racist activities, as well as asking questions, focusing on material, we are actually creating more racist behavior and the expectation that it's there even when it's not. So all the discussions being had, all the questions being asked, all the papers being read, all the discussions in the classroom may be producing more hostile attribution bias. And so I bring this up here with AIM because this is an important tool, that an NAS tool that's been used for a long time to help schools identify their climate on inclusivity and multiculturalism. So it's a tool that they've created. It's a tool that the accreditation bodies use. It is a tool that the NAS sets. You can see here the standards for criteria for in how it has to be used, how it has to be done, how it fits into the accreditation process. And then you can hire NIS consultants to help you through this process. That's one issue. The other is that the questions and how they're asked, as well as how they're interpreted. If you look at results of schools that have gone through it, you might look and say, hey, doesn't look like there's a huge problem. Well, no matter how the assessment comes out, there is a way to create the need for more DEI work, not only, and the fact that you are failing in a sense, and it could affect your accreditation, and then selling on top of it consulting. So there's double-edged sword and multiple things associated with this particular tool. Next. Okay. So here, so what are the implications? So, everything you've heard about the NAS, looking at some of the tools and individuals, what does that mean? And what are the issues? And so I want to start here by saying it could impact one of the first questions is, where does DEI sit within your school, right? It can be a component of it that works with the curriculum, that works with, professional development, that works with admissions, or it can be all-encompassing, to be the leader that everything else folds into. And that becomes an important question to look at, to understand the dynamics of the school, what's going on, and where you need to look or pay attention, and how to impact change. And so really, there's implications for the work with the NAS in terms of admissions, hiring, curriculum, teacher training, Board of Trustees roles, parents' roles, discipline and conflict management, and restorative justice, and just the student experience. Next slide. So when you think of the trustees, I like to think of the NAS essentially as a union, right? That's a great way to think about it. It is the independent school union, and the Board of Trustees essentially is a school board in some sense, different responsibilities and such. What we're seeing happen on time, if you look at the history and talk to schools and talk to trustees and look at documentation, right, you can see a transition where there was a role for parents and trustees in the school, more transparent, input-driven. What's happened over the years with the NIAS is a drive to make the Board of Trustees more insular. And so there is less transparency, as well as parents are being pushed out of the equation, and in some places negated. And it is, I believe, very purpose-driven, right? You have a Board of Trustees. Their role is in hiring a head of school that a search firm from the NIS can bring you to, a development program from the NIS can develop, and they also have aspiring head of school programs as such. So it ends up putting all of the power and processes into one head of school, whereas it's much more insulated for the changes that they want to make. And I bring this up here because you can see on the right-hand side, here's a slide from a NIS event. And these were noted as enemies of the NIS or the NYNAS. And you can see here a number of names, and a lot of these up here are parent groups who are asking questions, parent groups who want to get back to focus on education, who want to focus on learning and just questioning why things are being done, how they're being done, trying to take an active role in their children's lives. And they've been deemed enemies of the state. In fact, I would even, I'm going to just quickly read Glasgow, who we saw earlier. He thinks parents are like white supremacists who stormed the Capitol, and that schools that admitted children were like the police officers. There's no true metaphor for independent schools than the moment of on January 6th, Glasgow said. When will we stop hiring the people on the inside who are opening the gates, essentially to parents? So trying to close those gates. Next slide. Hiring and admissions. We see, if you look at job postings, you can see certain things and focuses on qualifications and characteristics, and it may be on DEI and justice. It may be on particular ABAR criteria. There are different, look at your children's schools postings, right? It's fascinating. It's impacting admissions. Here is something from the Latin School of Chicago that supposedly the screening out of non-progressive Jews is essential for critical race theory, DEI zealots. For if Jews fail to admit their privilege and the need to make amends to victims, then the entire woke narrative falls apart given historic and current discrimination against Jews, the largest per capita hate crime victim group in America. Next slide. It impacts teachers and teaching. I think an important point here that I'd like to get across, and this can be talked about at a later time, is that what's happening inside for teachers is they're having to focus their class lessons with an element of social justice. So every lesson, no matter what the class is, be it English, history, math, science, and they have to spend a lot of time focusing on making those connections, drawing out those plans, and it's taking time away from focusing on the kids, focusing on the teaching, focusing on being able to address kids where they are and notice the little things, right? Not just, how they're doing in school, what they need, and it's definitely taking away from that. Next slide. Here's just some of the books that you might find, some articles. Next slide. And what does that mean for students? Well, it means that they're facing affinity groups. And if we look, they're facing false information that are based on certain pedagogies and leanings, such as false maps of Israel, or they're focusing on articles and discussions around the classical roots of white supremacy. There's many more implications, not just for the classroom, but for their overall wellness and well-being. It's having an impact on how they view themselves. It's having an impact on how they view others. It's having an impact on how they view the administration and the school. Next slide. So all very quick, again, a lot more meaty in each of those sections, but what can you do? So if we look at these 10 things, and they're pretty broad right now, but there is meaning behind each of those, and we'll be sending out some materials on that, as well as having follow-up webinars on a number of topics, including a further in-depth look at what you can do. But I think one of the things, there's continuums of schools, right? When you look at the schools and where they fall on working with the NIS and pulling in the philosophies, you have those that are hook, line, and sinker, really looking at the power and oppressor or oppression, such as the Latin School of Chicago. You have other schools who are using the NAS as resources. They maybe don't know what to do, maybe they don't have the time, maybe a little lazier or inexperienced. And so the one-stop shop is great. There's others that are really trying to do right and may not know the exact way, but are willing to work to get it right. And the NAS is, again, that one-stop shop that they're used to using. And so it's a matter of educating. And then you have schools that are doing incredible work, are independent, beyond independent. One example, I know there's a lot of New York people on the call. The Birchwathen Lenox School in New York City is doing an amazing job. And so you have that spectrum, and it's important to get the landscape of of these schools first and try to understand where you stand. And you do that by educating yourself, by building relationships to get the information you need, to get the support you need. Show, don't tell, ask, don't accept. Show what's going on, show what's problematic. Don't just tell somebody that it's a problem. You need to be able to explain it, both to administrations, to their parents. Also ask, don't accept. When somebody gives you uses the word activist, ask what they mean by that. Don't just accept it. Be able to have discussions around it in other ways. Document everything. I think it's really important to be a resource and provide solutions, meaning, there's a lot of problems or there's a lot of things you might not like. It's always good to come with solutions and be seen as a resource. Advocate for change within your school, within your community, and stay engaged. It's constant. Unfortunately, school has changed and the need to be involved from a day-to-day basis changes. And I will say there's also a difference between younger kids versus older kids. Older kids have had the opportunity to live a life without DEI. They're able to recognize and see what's going on, what may be wrong, and identify it and be able to talk about it. For younger kids, this is the bubble that they're growing up in. And you really need to be engaged to understand what they're learning and what they're taking away from it. Be strategic in how you look at things and how you work with people. You can do it collectively, locally, state, regionally, and nationally. Don't do it alone. Find others and do it collectively. And of course, stay the course or make a change. Meaning, I love my school. I'm a private school parent. I love my school. I think there's definitely some ways that we need to navigate back in the right direction, and I'm working to stay the course. For others, it may be untenable, and you ultimately, after trying everything or working through it, may need to make a change. So I think I probably ran over a little bit of time, but so much there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to Brandy and Mika and Evie. Thank you so much. I mean, what material you just gave us, and we will do a follow-up. I mean, the slides, the amount of information that you all called, outstanding. So let's do this. We have there have been different comments, just so you know, that have been showing up. We have someone who was on the call tonight who was actually at the conference, the POCC conference, and was there and had to take her students out of one of the seminars, evidently, based on exactly what we've been talking about tonight. There were a couple of links that people put in for some articles that seem very relevant. I can't, because of the technology, I can't actually click through those, but I have believe that there should be some good information in there to check out. I open the floor up if people want to drop questions into the chat, but I'll throw out a question just to kind of get things started a little bit, which is, listen, it's so easy to want to come out and you hear some of the information, you just want to like start swinging all over the place. And Evie, you kind of walked us down like, okay, just here's some really good steps to follow through to keep the temperature right. So those 10 steps, all great. What is the take, though, on DEI? Like, do we just blanket come out like, oh my God, if I see DEI listed on a school, stay away from that school? How do you handle when you see something like that it's part of the program, part of the kind of mission statement or whatever it might be there? If whoever wants to jump in on that.
So I'll jump in. I think that one of the things that we get asked that question a lot, like, do you agree with DEI? Do you think we need to just get rid of DEI? Is DEI the root of all evil? I think that that's not actually the first question to ask. I think the first question to ask is, what's the goal of any program in school? Mm-hmm. So asking, a lot of schools, public and private schools, will put a DEI statement that they're trying to make an anti-racist school, or they're going to make sure that they demonstrate a commitment to equity and justice. But that doesn't really say what that means. Mm. So to me, I think the first question is, what's the goal of the program? And then make an assessment of, well, does that goal make sense? Does that goal adhere to civil rights policies and laws? Is that goal measurable? Does the school have a plan for if their intended goal has unintended consequences? And then my second question that I would ask is everything in the school being kind of filtered through this DEI funnel? So, when I also have a kid that goes to private school, if I pay tuition for my child to get a certain level of learning, be exposed to a certain level of scholarship in school, that if the DEI filter is taking away from that, then I think it's up to the adults in the room to reassess kind of the purpose of that initiative. Mm-hmm.
And I think that what's really important is the reassessment. Is the school open to doing regular assessments of what that means within their school and how it's impacting their school? It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to put into something that doesn't work. It's okay, but here it doesn't work, or it's problematic, or it's causing this. How are we going to alter it? And so if you see a school, if you see a head of school, trustees, administration who are willing to work to get it right, because I do believe a majority of the schools, they're doing this because they want the best for children. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of execution.
Great. Thank you. One of our attendees tonight wrote the following. This is from Leora Rez, and I hope I pronounced the last name or names right. My child goes to an NAIS school. I approached the head of school, and they had no idea anything had happened. And none of the kids attending this conference heard either of these speakers. What should I request? A resignation from NAIS doesn't make sense and is too drastic. Reactions?
That's a great question. I think that is a common thread we're hearing, actually talking to heads of school and parents. A lot had not heard because there's so many people, so many things going on, and also it's just not at the top of their priority list in the scope of what they're doing. I think that there's a lot of things that you can ask for in terms of, actually you can reassess why you're involved with the NAS, right? That is the first question. You don't need to be a part of the NAS. And I'm not suggesting that you stop being an NAS if they're providing value. But what is that value? And what is it? How is it serving you and your students? And so asking to leave, to reassess, not leave, like until they put in certain guidelines, certain priorities, because this is not the first year it happened, right? It's been ongoing and it's been internalized for quite a while. And so I think schools have a right to ask for change. If they're going to be sending students and faculty and spending money, you want to ensure that you're getting the best out of it. So I think that, first making that step would send a signal to the NIS.
I just want to add one thing, and Mika, you could probably speak to this a little bit more. Everyone right now, especially, it was just last month, is talking about the People of Color Conference, but Mika listed a whole host of other conferences and webinars and resources and materials that are equally problematic. So even if, and hi, Leoric, I'm glad you're on here. But even if a student wasn't exposed to what happened at that one conference, somebody mentioned in the comments that the teachers were, and again, the association is providing a whole host of other problematic materials that are making their way into private school classrooms.
Right, and I just want to reiterate what Evie said, because I actually think it's right. Say, oh, resign from the NAS in protest, that does sound strong, right? But it's about the approach. If you say, I would like you to assess, what are the outcomes? Let's have a discussion about what is the value add here, and we can look up both sides of the ledger. And actually, someone in the chat just made a great point that what are the ways that schools are measuring the success of DEI efforts? And that's a great question, because I don't think the way that people who are really steeped in this DEI work think about it is that it's ongoing work. You have to continue to do the work, and so there's never really an end point. Like, how do we measure who gets less racist over time, right? How do we measure how many microaggressions did I commit today? And so that's the problem, which I think is worth a discussion. What is the ultimate outcome that we want from these programs? How does it jive or not jive with educational outcomes? Can my kids come out of their math class actually doing math? Do they know what a gerund is when they leave English class? And measure up what we care about more. And I think asking for that kind of assessment is appropriate and totally fair and not an overreaction.
One of the things that came up in the chat, someone mentions, and we've seen this, is where the names shift. So 1 minute it's called DEI something. What do you do when it shape shifts and name shifts? How to respond with that?
And in fact, that's one of the workshops about what doesn't kill DEI makes it stronger. That's happening at Thrive this year. Again, you've got to look at the fine print. You've got to look at, okay, the name shifts, but the people who are giving the training don't shift. Generally, the content that they're teaching doesn't shift generally, and so it's, as Evie said, it's unfortunately you have to stay. I'm just going to say, as Evie said for everything I say, you have to stay on top of it, right? You have to remain active and remain vigilant about what's going on in your kid's school.
And I'm just want to add something on a more local level. I think because you recognize it when you're looking at materials, whether somebody's teaching it or not, if your kid's coming home with something, even how questions are asked. If you look, I look at, unfortunately, I'm very, every day I'm looking at homework. I'm reading all the books that my children read. And if a question is asked, for example, what are the consequences of, Christopher Columbus coming to America? Well, that's a problematic approach, as opposed to what is the outcome of Christopher Columbus coming to America, both good and bad, right? And so you can tell it's not just about the consultants, it's not just about the speakers. It's about looking at your own school and seeing how they are training the teachers, how the teachers are being taught to do things. And you just, what else can you ask for? It doesn't have to all revolve around the NIAS. You can look at what can you ask for your school? What kind of, neutrality statement can you get from the school? What kind of training can you get on controversial issues? Or how can you get teachers retrained on how to ask questions and teach it? So there's other things outside of just the NIAS. And so DEI names may change 100%. You know that it's still there because you will see it in the content and the questions and what your kids come back with.
So what do we tell our kids? What do you tell your child who comes home and is like, oh, look at this lesson. I need to do this. This is really important for all of my friends in school. Like, what do you tell your kids?
Can you just repeat that one more time?
Yeah. In other words, a student comes home with the question, okay, let's take the Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, this was terrible. Look at how awful Columbus is. We should not honor him in any way. There should no longer be a day named for him. And so how do we approach the student, our own students in our family, when they come home or they're taking math classes where they're studying statistics, because it's important to understand statistics and ratio, but the statistics that are given have to do with the death toll in Gaza and what Israel has done to the Palestinians. How do we respond to that? And what do we tell our students? It's one thing to talk to, obviously, you're going to talk to faculty or talk to the administrators. What do we tell our kids?
I mean, I think part of it is really making sure that that the information that they've received, one, is accurate, because that's really where it starts. I think that one of the problems with the question, as Evie posed it initially about Christopher Columbus, is it's a leading question. So it's designed to get a student to a very specific answer and only that answer. And one of the things that for me, as a mother, telling my kids or asking my kids questions or looking at the materials that they're being taught is to make sure, one, are they accurate? And if a kid is presented with multiple viewpoints and still comes to a conclusion, fine. I mean, that's kind of the point. You want a student to come to a conclusion that's grounded in fact and reality and some of their own thought. That's critical thinking. I think the problem that we're seeing, unfortunately, is too often that's not what's happening.
And I also think that there is parental responsibility in educating your children, right? You don't just shepherd them off to school and okay, they're going to deal with it. That's what discussion around the dinner table is for. That's what sort of reading together on the weekends is for. Discussing the news is for. It's to teach your child to think critically and not lead them to conclusions. And I think that, so if they come home with that kind of thing, well, then have a discussion. That generates discussion. But I think... we have to also educate our own children.
100% that, yes, we have to, and much more than we ever had to do before, right? At some point, or thought that we would have to do. And it comes back to making the child also present the two options. I mean, for me, it's, okay, there was the question, but tell me now, what were the benefits? And what isn't included here? What haven't you talked about here? Definitely. So having those kind of discussions of both sides, whether you agree with it or not, right? I always say, I don't care what opinion you have, even if we disagree, as long as you can stand behind it and you have facts to support it. And so teaching them to do that in those discussions when you see those materials becomes very important. I also would 100% be going into the school regarding, and I did around that question, and a wide range of things. And I tell my child, right? I think having the conversation about, listen, this is not okay. It's biased, and here's why. A better way of writing the question would have been this way. And actually, I'm going to go in and talk to your teacher now. So they know the whole process, that not only is it their responsibility to be able to back up anything they think and want to stand behind, but that you will make sure that the teachers and the schools do it as well. And you will as well.
Great. Thank you. What about the NIAS then? Right? Like, someone wrote one of our questions, friend Newcomb wrote, is it just a bully pulpit? Like, or is it a bully? Like, is it its own, like, how much power? It seems like it has a lot of influence. Obviously, when you see parallel language from the NIAS showing up in other independent schools. But if an independent school is an independent school, can't it just do its own thing?
We're missing a step here. So the missing step is the state and local accreditation organizations. So if they rely on standards that are set by the NAIS to then grade and measure a private school, well, I mean, if I were running a private school, I would want to be accredited by my state or local accreditation org. So yeah, at that point, is it a bully? Kind of. In that situation, yeah, it operates that way. I think that we have to be pay attention to that point. What is the state accreditation org doing? Are they just acting kind of as a step in for the NAIS? They're just kind of the NAIS in disguise at the state level, to where all of the NAIS standards are being put through that. But then also to look at it is, are there other orgs out there that are providing the resources that the National Association is providing? Because right now, a lot of private schools are members, a lot of teachers are members of the National Association, because they are getting resources from that membership.
And I think it's also a prestige thing. Let's advertise our school and say, hey, we're a member of the NAIS. We send X amount of teachers every year to X conference, and then they get this professional development. And so it's a way for schools to advertise, to try and set themselves apart. And that gives the NAIS some power.
There's definitely many reasons to be a part of the NAIS, whether it is in part, there is some value to it in name, or the resources of being able to source teachers, because teachers are very, hard to find, whether it's to get the data. I think, Randy brought up the accreditation bodies. That becomes a very important part, right? That's the main thing you need. You don't need to be a part of the NAIS. But to meet standards, especially for colleges and such, it's, I go back to the concept of the NAS being a monopoly. And ultimately, what do you need to do to a monopoly? You need to break it. Why? Because at some point there's complacency. There's no need to change. There's no need to listen to customer demands. They don't have to. And we have to find a way to force that change.
Really important points. So who are the good actors? Who are the people that organizations that we might be directed to, looking to understand, to help us navigate the waters as parents or educators?
I mean, I think that the enemies of the state list that Evie pointed out are some of the organizations that have been really trying to stand up and be a voice with parents. Obviously, our organization, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, this is what we do. But I mean, I would look at those orgs first.
It is interesting sometimes when you see who's opposed to something, you think, oh, well, that's exactly why we might want to align ourselves with a little bit, or at least look into them more significantly for support. We're just about out of time. So I don't know if you want to do a quick go around in our crew here, and I'm just watching the chat as well. Any last comments to start to close off our time together? What we should be doing or paying attention to?
So, I mean, I just want to say we are going to send out the slides and a list of some resources, including some of the articles and materials that we briefly touched on during our presentation after this, in the next couple of days, to everyone who attended, whose email address hopefully we have. And I want to thank everybody for joining. And I also want to mention that this is probably just the first of many different webinars we have that we're going to hold on this topic, because there's a lot more to go into.
And to that end, like, if there are things that you heard tonight that you want more depth in, or other things that you did not hear that you want more depth in, please email so that it can be addressed and we can think about that for future webinars.
And I also want to thank my co-panelists, Mark for being such a wonderful moderator, and you all for joining, and just reiterate that if you feel as if there's a problem in your school and you don't know where to start in terms of reaching out, and you don't know how to begin, that is what JILV is here for. So please, shoot us a message, and we will get back to you, and we will help you. So you're not alone in this fight.
Absolutely not.
Great. Friends, thank you so much for joining us tonight online for this evening. First off, many thanks to Brandy and to Mika and to Evie for your time, for your expertise, your advice, and certainly, as evidence to everyone on the call, your passion on the topic that is so important. And whether or not we have children or whether or not we have students, in these independent schools, it matters for all of us. Education is the backbone of our society and frames and creates an informed and an engaged citizenry. We at the JALV are working diligently to address K-12 education and how to make sure our schools are centers for genuine learning and critical thinking, so that today's children will be the best suited to be proud, smart, and engaged Americans. You can learn more at www.jilv.org, where you can also donate to our efforts in order to help assist us and support our research and our advocacy and our teaching. So with that, we wish everyone a good night. And again, we will follow up with the recording from this and the resources. And of course, stay in touch.